Hi, I'm Connor Quimby, and this is how to overthrow a language. In the past, this used to be done by more brutal ways, but we're going to be looking at this through the eyes of 2022. We have international law. There will be no Balkan methods discussed in this video. There is an old saying that a country is just a language with an army. You can conquer a country and you can destroy an army, but how do you overthrow a language and assimilate the people most effectively? In this video, I'm going to present an 8-point checklist, and we're going to go over a language that is on the last point of the checklist, and we're also going to go over a language that kind of stopped midway through the checklist and is now on its way towards revival. We're also going to go over a hypothetical at the end. Step 1 is to make sure you have a lot of geopolitical influence and essentially control over the region or country where the language is spoken. So as awesome as it would be, Brazil is unable to overthrow the Danish language at this current moment because it does not have enough geopolitical influence in the Danish belts. The example language that we're going to be using is the Uyghur language, which is spoken in East Turkestan in Central Asia. This area is currently controlled by Communist China, but it has always been a part of the Chinese geopolitical sphere, mainly because of the Silk Road and the trade routes around the Taklamakan Desert. Step 2 is to eat the nation, and by eat the nation I mean absorb all the territory of the language speakers into your own territory. If the language is still spoken in a sovereign area, you're not going to be able to overthrow it. The Uyghur language has been absorbed into the Han state multiple times, in 1757, in 1877, in 1934, and in 1949. Prior to the most recent absorption, the Chinese government didn't keep going down the checklist that I've written on how to overthrow a language, which brings us to step 3, forbid the language in schools. By outlawing the language in schools and making education in your language, you do two things. First, you push down the social status of the original language, and second, you make sure that students understand and are proficient in your language first, for all academic and higher thinking. Back to our Uyghur example, all schools in Xinjiang are mandatory Chinese. You are not allowed to speak Uyghur or you will be punished. This is one of the most effective methods of overthrowing a language, although it does take some time. Step 4 is to change the demographics. You do this by having a massive surge in immigration to the region, with the goal of making the people who speak the original language the minority. If you look at the population of East Turkestan, about 45% of it is Uyghur and 42% is Han, with about 15% other. And that Han percentage is continually rising as more Han Chinese migrate towards the region. Step 5 is to remove the official status of the language. So make it so there's no legal documents in the language, you can't be represented in court in the language. All official services, everything run by the government needs to be in your language, because if you give government representation in any form to the other language, then more people will keep using it and you will have a harder time overthrowing the language. Communist China hasn't actually done this yet, as it violates their linguistics rights clause in their constitution, but I'm sure you can guess how well they actually follow through with that. So what China does instead is repress the language as much as they can without explicitly outlawing it, because they fear if they amend the constitution to revoke those linguistic rights, then their international image will be lowered even further than it already has been. Step 6 is to phase out media representing the language. This is super easy if all your media is state-controlled. And you can absolutely do it with private media too. You just need to influence them, and it takes a bit longer. So naturally, there's barely any media in the Uyghur language because China wants it to be in Mandarin Chinese. Even the Uyghur Times, which is the only newspaper I could find after 5 seconds of a Google search about Uyghurs, is based outside of China, in Washington, D.C. I've listed step 7 as China moment. I'm using China moment to basically mean assimilate as much as humanly possible, repress the original ethnicity and language and culture under the guise of civilization. This is what China is doing with the Uyghurs. This is what Canada did with the residential schools. This is what the United States did with many of its own indigenous languages. This is what Soviet Russia did. So if you want to overthrow a language, be like China. And now, step 8, wait. Because again, we're doing this without the usage of Balkan strategies. So if you've checked off everything in the checklist, give it a bit of time, 2 to 3 generations, the language is already going to be listed as endangered because it's being repressed to such an extent and new learners aren't going to be able to prosper. The grandchildren of the generation who was alive when you started the overthrow is probably going to be the last substantial native-speaking generation. Give it another 1 or 2 generations, and by then you'll probably have no native speakers left at all. This is all China needs to do with Uyghur at the moment. They just need to wait. They just need to keep doing what they're doing, which I should put a disclaimer here just in case, is awful. I am not endorsing it. And yeah, that's a checklist on how to overthrow a language. Now, we're going to talk about a very lucky language, which only got about halfway down the checklist, and as a result, is currently being revived. But first, a huge thank you to all my Patreon supporters, because they're awesome. Thank you to Kiranik, Albert Jones, Evil Hag, Benny, Agmashwa, Obfuscable, Pirate, Eden, Acorn, G Plum Bob, and Babalingua. Support from my Patreon supporters is a large reason I'm able to keep making content, and I'm very grateful to them. So if you would like to help out the channel, consider supporting me on Patreon, and of course subscribing if you haven't already. Now, let's talk about Olelo Hawaii. Hawaiian is my favorite Austronesian language, and originally this video was just going to be about the fall and the rise of Hawaiian. But I of course got other ideas, as you can tell by the 6 minutes preceding this section. So let's talk about Hawaiian and how far it got down on the checklist of how to overthrow a language. Hawaii really started to come under the geopolitical influence of the United States in 1819, when American missionaries started frequently traveling the islands. And throughout the 19th century, American businessmen and missionaries continued to go to the islands, set up shop, settle down even, to the point where there are Americans born in Hawaii and American businesses owned the majority of the land. Due to the missionaries, the people of Hawaii were extremely literate, one of the most literate societies in the world at the time. But a decreasing native population due to disease over the 19th century meant that Hawaiian was able to progress to step number 2 on our list, get eaten by the United States. The decline of Hawaiian really accelerated in 1893 when the Republic started. And of course, the get eaten by the United States part was completed in 1897 when Hawaii was annexed by then President William McKinley. Step 3 started in 1896 when a law was passed to make the English language the medium of basis of instruction in all public and private schools, provided that where it is desired that another language shall be taught in addition to the English language, then the school could allow it, but English was the main language still. Step 4 is immigration. In the early 1900s especially, hundreds of thousands of Filipino workers, Japanese, Chinese, and Americans migrated to Hawaii and set up their lives there. In 1920, full and part Hawaiians only made up about 20% of all students in Hawaiian schools. And today, only about 10% of the state is actually native Hawaiian, with only about 25,000 native speakers of the language. But after this, the United States kind of stopped going down the checklist. Hawaiian is an official language of Hawaii. There's a lot of Hawaiian media relative to the amount of speakers. We're not doing a China moment. The number of speakers is going up due to the increasing amount of Hawaiian language education and activism and awareness of the language, especially within native Hawaiian communities. That's not to say Hawaiian's in a great spot right now. It's still very much an endangered language, but it's doing better than it has been in the past, and that's great. Hawaiian gets the Connor Quimby seal of approval. Lastly, in this video, we're going to go over a hypothetical scenario. Do you remember at the beginning when I said that Brazil could not overthrow the Danish language? Well, what if they could? How could Brazil overthrow the Danish language? The easiest way for this to happen would be for Portugal and Brazil to unite in a political union. By this, Brazil can gain access to the European Union, and thereby put Denmark in its geopolitical sphere of influence. It would take some work, of course. Now, what Brazil needs to do next is take its large population, hopefully a better economy at this point, and federalize the EU so that Denmark is essentially a province of Brazil. Now, Brazil can give independence back to every single European country except Denmark, and Schleswig-Holstein, the northernmost province of Germany, because there is a significant Danish-speaking minority there. Now, Brazil can close all the borders with Europe so that the Danish people are stuck in Brazil. At this point, it's really easy. All Brazil needs to do is remove Danish as a language in schools, flood Denmark with Brazilian people, remove all the legal status of Danish in Brazil, phase out media in Danish, and turn it into China. And at that point, they just need to wait. Brazil can remove Danish from existence. It is possible. It should be done. Vamos Brasil, and thank you for watching. This has been How to Overthrow a Language.